Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this plenary session. We're joined by two excellent economists who have studied the issue of anti-competitive forces in the labor market. And we're going to hear from one in a very key policy position and one who does the research that helps to inform the policy decisions of a lot of people a lot of time. So I'm going to start by introducing our first guest, and that is Heather Boushey. Dr. Boushey, actually, in full disclosure, is a very longtime friend of mine, and we are both alums of the Economic Policy Institute. But Dr. Boushey is the co-founder and former president of the Center for Equitable Opportunity and CEO of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. In testament to how well she did as co-founder, she left that position to now be the chair, to be a member of the president's economic advisors. And she's a former LIRA board member. So Heather, let me pose the first question to you, because the White House issued a very interesting white paper listing steps the administration believes it should be taking, understands need to be taken to address the forces that have made the labor market less competitive than we hoped. So what's in that paper, and why was it important for the president to have the big brains of the economic team there put this out?
Thank you so much, Bill. And thank you, Lyra. It's just a real delight to be able to be here today virtually, especially since I think it's going to start pouring here in Washington, D.C. So I think we're probably all glad that we're via Zoom. And I would consider you a dear friend, Bill. So, very happy to be here. So let me start by just giving a quick summary of the president's competition agenda, and then we can talk about some of the other part of your question. From day one, the president has been focused on promoting competition in the economy. And as part of that, from day one, there has been an attention to the fact that that means we need to keep the labor market competitive, and that we need to make sure that workers are fairly compensated for their work. So almost a year ago, the president signed an executive order on promoting competition in the American economy. And here we highlighted the importance of competitive labor markets in creating high quality jobs, providing workers the freedom to switch jobs, and empower workers to negotiate higher wages. And this was a whole of government framework. We say that a lot over here at the Biden administration. Lots of things we do are whole of government. And that basically means that every agency is being directed to participate in this agenda. So as a part of that executive order, there were roughly a dozen agencies that were tasked with doing over 70 specific actions that would remove barriers to entry and encourage more competition. And this includes really important things for the labor market, like encouraging the Federal Trade Commission to ban or to limit non-compete agreements, to address the issue of unnecessary occupational licensing restrictions, and to strengthen the Department of Justice's antitrust guidance to prevent employers from collaborating to suppress wages or reduce benefits or other sorts of things. It also established a governance structure, a White House Competition Council, that has been meeting regularly to monitor our progress across all of these. And part of that monitoring of the progress has been a series of things that have been released. The Treasury Department, as you noted, Bill, released a groundbreaking report showing how the lack of competition in labor markets harms workers. That was an explicit mandate in the executive order that Treasury did that. Under the leadership, I will note, of Ben Harris, who was a longtime Biden aide, and this has been a key issue that he was really focused on. So it was great to see them be able to deliver on that report. And if you haven't seen it, it's quite excellent. And the Department of Justice and the Department of Labor have launched a new partnership to promote competition in labor markets. And there's been a series of other steps that have been taken. We elevated this issue in one of the chapters of the economic report of the president and talked specifically about how this related to issues around racial and gender equity. And I'm happy to talk about that more, time permitting. But basically, I mean, I think that, to your question, Bill, this has been a big focus. I want to add one other thing that may seem a little bit out of the lane, but I think is very connected to this issue, which is that the president has also been very focused on the importance of unions. So one of the, when you think about what's happened in the labor market, rising concentration, one way to deal with that is to break up the concentration of employers. Another way to deal with that is to give employees, to give workers the power to bargain collectively on their own behalf, to provide that counterweight to the concentrated economic power of firms. And so the president has been focused on supporting unions. He likes to think that and say that he's the most pro-union president, certainly in my lifetime, and I'm proud to serve him for that, if only for that reason. In April of 2021, he signed an executive order that established the White House Task Force on Worker Organizing and Empowerment, and the task force has been ongoing. They have released nearly 70 recommendations focusing on how the federal government can serve as a model employer and support issues around information and transparency and all the things when it comes to organizing rights for workers. So there are a bunch of things that the administration has been focused on, and this is a thorny issue that requires a lot of actions by a lot of different agencies. But the president is doing what he can to try to focus our attention on this. Back over to you, Bill.
Thanks so much. Our other panelist is Ioana Marinescu. She is Associate Professor, Faculty Research Fellow with the NBER, but Associate Professor at the University of Pennsylvania. She's also one of the Associate Editors of the Quarterly Journal of Economics. And if you love podcasts, she has a podcast, Just Economics. So, Professor Marinescu, this is a live grenade for us economists and policymakers. This is a real live policy discussion taking place here in Washington. You're noted for lots of research, excellent research, but among that is your deep dive into issues of wage determination, monopsony power, and the intersection with antitrust law and how that affects the labor market. So for you, this is, one of those moments where you're the expert on something Washington is seriously discussing. How do you think your research helps to inform this debate? Are you taking victory laps? And what do you think the key findings of your research feed into this understanding?
Thanks, Bill. Thanks again for having me. It's tremendous to see this kind of research and interest in wage suppression taking front stage in policy and the discipline of economics as well. I think, for a long time, economists have assumed that it's, workers are roughly paid their worth. That means, we say their marginal productivity. And of course, people knew that that's not always exactly the case, but we thought it's a good enough approximation. And I think that idea has recently been, so to speak, debunked, certainly that this should be the basic assumption over a number of years with my own work and also that of colleagues. So in particular, we've shown, for example, that greater levels of employer concentration or labor market concentration are associated with lower wages. So in other terms, when workers have fewer employers that they can turn to for jobs, you see lower wages in that market. There's also research that looks specifically, and that's going to be relevant for antitrust, at mergers, and shows that when two companies merge, right, that it reduces the number of employers that workers can choose between, right? So there's less competition, and we can see that in those cases, wages decline, but only in markets where the merger was sufficiently important that it really increased concentration. So in other terms, when you see a stark decrease in competition because of a merger, that's where you see wages decline. And again, this is because workers have nowhere to turn to or fewer opportunities, and that allows employers to pay them less. So we showed that in general in the US, the level of concentration is quite high, with 60% of labor markets being highly concentrated by the standards of the federal merger guidelines, for example. So what is highly concentrated, just to give you an idea, this threshold implies that there's only 4 employers if they were equal size. 4 employers or fewer of equal size would be a highly concentrated market. Okay, so 60% of markets in the US, of labor markets, fall into that category. And then the other thing that we've been doing in my research is looking at some of the reasons why employers are able to pay workers less than their productivity. And one of them, as we just evoked, might be concentration, and perhaps that lowers worker bargaining power. But another interesting reason is what we call job differentiation. So that's the fact that in the classic competitive model, you assume that the worker has this current job maybe, but right next door there's an exactly equivalent job, and if the employer dared to pay them 1 cent less, they would immediately leave to this equivalent job next door. Of course, reality is far from that. And so jobs are very different, and not every job is equal in the eyes of a given worker. And one of the things we show is that distance matters a lot. And that's why I'm talking about jobs next door. The job next door is one thing. If it takes you an hour to commute to this other job, maybe this other job pays more, but it's not an equivalent job, right? So what we show then is that jobs are really differentiated. They're different in the eyes of workers, and in particular because of distance. And that allows employers to underpay workers because, again, there's only so many jobs that are at the appropriate distance, for example, from the worker's perspective. So in other terms, employers have market power because their jobs are unique in the eyes of workers, are not easily replaceable. And therefore, that allows employers to underpay workers. And we come up with some estimate that workers are perhaps about 20% more productive than the wages that they get paid because of this lack of competition in labor markets. And of course, that opens the door to potential policy interventions to try to address this wage suppression through a variety of channels. And we can talk more about what some of those might be.
So Heather, the economic report of the president is an academic exercise in many ways, though it argues for the foundation for the president's policies. You mentioned an element of dealing with racial and gender equity that was raised in that chapter. A form of stickiness for workers, of course, comes from discrimination in the labor market. And these wage structures can keep jobs from being equivalent, actually, because of that discrimination. What's in the economic report of the president that helps to highlight a lot of the foundations for what the White House is doing?
Well, a lot of cites to Iana's research, first and foremost, but also I stepped away for a second. I wanted to get the copy of it. I have a hard copy, but you can get it online. And chapter 5 is on barriers to economic inequality, the role of monopoly, and discrimination. And it was a fantastic chapter to get to work on with my colleagues who are just incredible, who helped with this. So I don't think I can name them, but I mean, they're thanked, but whatever, I don't want to call specific folks, but a terrific group of people really focused on, how we connect the dots between labor market discrimination and competition. And basically the nut of the chapter is that these are different ways that employers have power in the labor market or exert their power in the labor market. And so as Ioana sort of noted, there is a wealth of evidence on the extent of and impacts from a lack of competition in the labor market. There's also a wealth of evidence on the role that discrimination plays across a variety of axes that leads to economic inequality and other forms of inequality. And so the chapter really tried to understand what some of the intersections were. one thing that, it starts off by talking about, labor market monopsony. I really honestly feel sorry if this is going to offend anyone, but I think we should have completely abandoned that term for policy discussions and talk about sole or limited numbers of employers. I mean, it's what it means, but it's a mouthful. But what that means when there is a limited options for workers to find employers for different kinds of jobs, and what that means for their pay and for employment. And as Ioana said, we cite all of the research, so much of the research that shows that monopsony power is prevalent and that it means that workers' wages are well below their level of productivity, which is a complete violation of the standard Econ 101 thinking that workers are paid their marginal product. But it's also the case that the effects of monopsony are not evenly distributed. There is a growing body of research that shows that a lack of competition reduces wages the most in lower wage labor markets, and that there is some evidence suggesting that women and people of color may be more affected by monopsony, and that it may actually contribute to gender and racial inequality. But even if monopsony is not the culprit in race and gender inequality, it is the case that these are that kind of discrimination limits the options of workers to find the right fit. And so anything that limits the potential of workers to find their right fit is part of what is dragging down their wages and making sure that their wages are not equal to their marginal product. So it's about power, but it's also about finding that right fit. I want to just touch on a few things that we focus on a lot in the chapter, which is that addressing this power, especially involves looking at a range of factors that can contribute to this power in the labor market. So Ioana already mentioned mergers and acquisitions. That is certainly an important place, and really does point to, and I hope we will have time to talk about policy implications, but that really does point to the important role that antitrust policy can play in addressing monopsony power. But, it's also the case that one of the other issues is, when it's difficult for workers to switch jobs. So, when you think about how this pertains to issues around labor market discrimination, or you think of something like the ban the box work, workers that might be disproportionately workers of color who show up in the labor market with criminal records, this limits workers' abilities to shift jobs, which is then lowering their potential to find that best fit. And so, the chapter walks through many of the different examples of that and how we really need to make sure that workers are mobile and have access to those options. I also want to spend a couple of minutes on a series of labor market practices that we have been talking about a lot over here in the Biden White House. Practices by employers that are working to limit worker mobility. So, for example, there are a host of different kinds of agreements that employers are increasingly requiring their workers to sign, like non-disclosure agreements that prohibit an employee or a former employee from disclosing information about their employer. Research is suggesting that overly broad, so not all of them necessarily, but that when those non-disclosure agreements are overly broad, that can reduce the reporting of workplace harassment. There's also things like non-compete agreements, which are often bundled with non-disclosure agreements in employment contracts, and which affected about 1 in 5 workers in the United States in 2014, which is the last year for which we have data on that. And that these serve to reduce earnings, and the effects appear to be, there's evidence that the effects are stronger, more strongly negative on the earnings of women and non-white workers. And, there's also all of the work that has been done showing that employer practices that promote pay secrecy can limit workers from applying for better paying jobs and can exacerbate workplace inequalities. And this is especially important because workers with low incomes are likely to underestimate the pay available at outside options. So, Ioana talked about workers are not all, she didn't use this word, but as she was talking, I was thinking we're not all widgets. candidates just fitting into jobs that are identical. But people, even if they are in jobs where maybe they could find a better fit or even the same job at a higher pay, workers tend to underestimate the pay available at outside options, and there's the information asymmetries there. Just a couple more, because this is such a long list. And I think what's really interesting about this long list of ways that employers are limiting mobility is that this is both a signal, both a symptom of market power on behalf of firms, and is also a way that they continue to practice discrimination, which lowers the wages that they have to pay workers. So a couple more are no pooch agreements, where compacts are made between employers who agree not to hire workers from each other for a specific period of time. So basically saying you can't switch jobs. I mean, that would have been like if at Equitable Growth, we'd said you can't switch between EPI and all these other think tanks and ours. I mean, that seems so egregious to me. And issues around occupational licensing. And I think personally, I think that, as I've looked into this over the years, occupational licensing, I think is a little bit tricky. But one of the things that we know is that today, roughly a quarter of jobs in the United States require a license, up from less than 5% in the 1950s. And fewer than 5% of occupations that require licensing in at least one state are treated consistently across all 50 states. So I think that, where we have really been focusing is on the national consistency. And why, whether or not the rules need to be different across place, although there is sort of the local, people may want to have control of their local labor markets. So, I think all of that really does sort of show those connections between market concentration, monopsony, and discrimination. And I will just end this section with another plug for the importance, which we talk about in the chapter, the importance of unionization, which has been shown to mitigate the negative effects of monopsony power on wages. Of course, unions increase wages. I can see Larry Michelle on my screen. He can tell you all about that on another panel. And they, of course, give workers the increased leverage to bargain with their employer, which serves as that counterweight to concentrated power. It's also the case that unions have the capacity to be important for equity. So we know that, overall, there has historically been an inverse relationship between the degree of union membership and income inequality. A really wonderful paper released a couple of years ago, really documenting that. Also, we know that high rates of union membership are increasing wages for Black workers. And for Black women specifically have led to a substantial reduction in the gap in their wages relative to white women. So there's also, I think we can all point to historical examples where unions have not been on the forefront of civil rights issues or inclusion, but there's a lot of evidence that when they are, that can really help provide this counterweight and, again, help workers find their better fit. Back to you, Bill. Thank you.
Thanks. So, Ioana, the work that you did on labor market concentration focused at the local level, the commute, the job place level. Often when we think of antitrust, though, we're really thinking of mergers of national corporations or multinational corporations. And so how do you think we can do something at the local level? Is there a way to reconceive antitrust? And similar to that, Heather's been making a point about unions. What about other interventions that are countervailing forces to monopsony? Are those also solutions? Do we need unions? Because a lot of this does take place not at the merger of big companies, but sometimes just because economies in many industries are economies of amalgamation. So you have similar employers together.
Right, so let me first address the point about antitrust. I think it's important to remember that the goal of antitrust is to promote competition in markets, and the idea of market is actually very important. So to the extent that a labor market is local, and we're trying to promote competition in the labor market, which, by the way, is included in the framework of antitrust as an input to the production function. So input markets are included. So you could also have the lumber market, when lumber is bought by some other producer as an input. labor is a special type of input, but it is an input and it's included. So then if we're looking at how the competitive process works in a labor market, to the extent that the labor market is local, that is going to be the relevant unit to be looking at. So if two firms, maybe big firms, national, are merging, what's going to matter is whether there is at least one labor market, a local labor market of a specific type of workers, where we can reasonably predict that there's going to be a significant decrease in competition following that merger, for example, because concentration increases a lot following that merger. And based on what we've seen, I mentioned the studies on mergers, we therefore expect lower wages for these workers in those specific markets. Importantly, it is the case in antitrust that it's enough to show that there is one such market, for the merger to be deemed anti-competitive. You don't need to, go around and look at every possible market. We identify some market where we think there are issues. Now, that doesn't necessarily lead to always blocking the merger, because there could be other solutions like divestitures, meaning, for example, the firm could get out of that market that's problematic. There's other things we could do. Nevertheless, as far as is this anti-competitive, it's enough to show one labor market where there's a problem to say that there is a competition issue for that particular merger. So I think in that sense, the tool is a very strong one that can effectively be used in the context of mergers and acquisitions. And in my paper with Herb Bovenkamp, we describe exactly how that would work. And interestingly, Heather mentioned no poaching agreements. And those are very interesting. First of all, everybody should know that a so-called naked no poaching agreement, where it's just a blanket agreement that we're not going to hire each other's employees with no particular reason, that's so-called per se illegal. I don't even need to prove you that it reduces wages, it's anti-competitive, etc. If I can prove that you've agreed, that's enough. And why? Because it's the same as wage fixing. If two producers say, hey, you know what, let's decide that the price is going to be this and that much, it's immediately anti-competitive. So these no poaching agreements are similar. I mean, it's not the same as wage fixing, but it's market division. I'm sorry. So hey, you take these customers, I take those customers. Let's agree to not compete. Let's say you're gonna take the Washington DC market, I'm taking the New York City market, and let's not compete with each other. It's the same thing, right? So this is just not conduct that is tolerated under our antitrust law. But it also plays a role in terms of understanding what would be the effect of a merger. Now, imagine two employers who had a no poaching agreement and now are telling us they want to merge. Well, they already exhibited anti-competitive, behavior with respect to labor before they merged. So we can very strongly expect that after they merge, they're going to suppress wages, because even before they were merging, they were already engaging in such behavior. That's a reason that we go through in my paper with Herb Bovenkamp. So I think, the beauty of antitrust is that we already have the tools. So we can reach for them and implement it, and, we'll make some progress with respect to monopoly power. Now, of course, this is not the only tool, as you said, right? So there's other aspects of the issue that can be addressed in different ways. So, for example, one of them is the minimum wage. So that's going to be very important. And critically, our work shows, we have a paper on the minimum wage, that, in most work, you see the minimum wage not having much effect on employment. And we showed that a plausible reason for that is because of this monopoly power. So basically, if wages are below, so this is wages, this is productivity, there's a gap, right? So then you say, oh, I'm going to introduce a minimum wage to raise wages. It doesn't go above productivity, so employers don't need to kick people out. And so that can explain why you don't necessarily see a negative employment effect. So therefore, for low-wage workers, the minimum wage is one way to fight monopoly power by raising those wages when they are too low. And then unions, of course, can also play a useful role. The literature has shown that the impact of a lack of competition on wages is not as negative, is not as strong when unions are there to resist those impacts. And therefore, that can also be a tool in our toolbox to address these issues. And that's interesting, because unions could act in a number of wage ranges. While the minimum wage will only reach the lowest paid workers, unions potentially have more leeway to act at different level of pay, and monopsony power, while it might be, in some studies it's not clear, but it might be slightly stronger for low-wage workers, it's extremely prevalent up and down the wage distribution, including for professors like myself. There's a great study showing that. So, this is something that is, market-wide problem. It's not just a problem for certain subcategories of workers, and something like unions, we can, think of a number of solutions, but has the potential to address that problem in a broader way than the minimum wage, also in a different way. And so, I just want to say, actually, I saw that Jake Rosenfeld is in the audience. We are going to release in a few weeks a paper on worker power. And so, there's a number of tools in the toolbox, and antitrust is one of them. It's a powerful one because we already have it, and it's underused for combating monopsony power, but there are other tools, and the issue of worker power is broader than just monopsony power. As we explain in that paper, there's a number of aspects to worker power that go beyond this issue around just like competition between employers.
So Heather, one of the things you mentioned that the White House did was give a directive to the antitrust division of the Justice Department. Where is the Justice Department now in that? Are they consulting with the CEA? They have their own economists, but and some people would say they may want to consult with the CEA on this. But where is that process now? It's still under review, or?
So certainly ongoing. CA has been very fortunate to have had detailees from DOJ who work on these issues. And so there has been a lot of back and forth. And, of course, respecting all of the appropriate boundaries when we talk to the agencies. But this is certainly an important issue. And as you noted, so let me just start by saying that I think it was an exciting development, an exciting moment when the administration decided, we should absolutely include labor market considerations in antitrust discussions. So, that was the first thing that we did, is just said, hey, we definitely need to, we agree that this is incredibly important and that we need to be using it in all the different ways that we can. And that has been the directive to the agencies. So, the here too, the sort of the whole of government approach. And one thing that has happened is that the Department of Labor has been collaborating with the Department of Justice to share their expertise across those two agencies to ensure that the antitrust work helps protect American workers. So if you have a team, there's a lot of economists at DOJ and FTC that work on these issues, but if you've not been thinking about the monopsony side issues, then those economists may not be, they just may not be as grounded in those questions. And so the collaboration with the Department of Labor is a really important piece of the puzzle, just to make sure that the experts understand all the ins and outs and understand it, specifically from the perspective of workers and the labor market. Because, antitrust regulation in terms of humans is going to be different in many cases than it is in terms of the merger of corporations and all the things. And I think Ioana has made a couple of those points as well. So I think that's the first thing. Then second, the Department of Justice has indicted several cases involving allegations of wage fixing and, quote, the no poaching agreements, which Ioana mentioned, with victims that include public school nurses, software engineers, and pandemic frontline workers. And then specifically one case that one case that has gotten some attention is that the Department of Justice has recently filed a complaint to block Penguin Random House from acquiring Simon & Schuster, who's of course a close competitor, but specifically on the grounds that the merger will further consolidate that it will have effects on author compensation. And so I think that specifically gets to some of the issues that Ioana was raising, but that, really focusing on the fact that this merger will limit the opportunities for authors to get contracts and to put books out has been a core part of that complaint. So those are just a few of the things that have been done. I will say that the Department of Justice and the FTC have begun the process for revising the merger guidelines, and they have already called for public comment on the labor market implications. One of the things that those of us who work in DC on policy, I just, because I have a bunch of academics here on the call, if you are all interested in this issue and you want to make your voice heard, doing a public comment is a great way to do that. Those are all read and taken very seriously and integrated into future iterations. And given how important this issue is, especially I know to many LIRA members and LIRA scholars, I would strongly encourage you to look into those, the revised merger guidelines and specifically the labor market implications.
Thanks. And Ioana, I want to change the subject just a little bit. One of the ways that firms practice monopsony is actually not to share job information. It's astounding how few firms publicly post jobs. In the current environment where we hear firms screaming and hollering how many openings they have, I have found this ironic in the sense that this is what we would think if you had monopsonies. And if you blew up the labor market, these are firms that have practiced non-competition type activities to get their workers. Suddenly, they're thrown into a storm because now they have to do something they haven't done before. They actually have to compete to get workers. One of the things you mentioned was they've gotten spoiled with the notion that they can pay lower wages than the marginal product of the workers. They don't have an actual sense of the value of their own workers. It just strikes me we're in one of those moments where this frustration of employers is further evidence that, yes, monopsony is a problem. Maybe the employer should be thanking you for highlighting this, because now maybe they see that solving this problem solves one of their problems.
Yes, for
Go
sure.
ahead,
This is a factor. One reason why employers may not want to raise wages enough. I mean, wages are increasing a bit. They're not quite keeping up with inflation, but they are increasing. One of the reasons why employers don't want to raise wages, is precisely monopsony power. So they complain that they can hire, but our models make us understand that partially why this is happening is because they are not willing to pay the price. Partially. I mean, then when you also have high labor market tightness, I mean, there's also an overall supply and demand issue that makes it hard to hire on top of that. So there's several issues at play here, but I think that is important. I see that Larry Michelle has a question. I don't know if we're taking questions, but.
Yeah, we're going to get to that in just one moment. I'm going to open it up. I just wanted to get your feedback on that, because this is a conundrum that we are still, with millions of people who are unemployed, who are looking, and we're characterizing this as a tight labor market. This has been a wonderful recovery. The employment to population ratio for Black men has already recovered. We've not had a recovery in which Black men are back to their previous epoch in under years. There are a couple of recoveries, we're talking a decade. So the fact that within 2 years that we're back to the same share of Black men holding jobs is beyond phenomenal. So there are some reasons you might say it's a tight labor market, but we know we still have a hard time clearing the long-term unemployed. And so trying to understand why are workers looking at this labor market differently than these headlines that say, oh, the labor market is tight, everybody's got a job, but these millions of people would tell you, then send me the job because I'm still looking. So I think, maybe we economists have some clues that we can improve expectations that people have of how this labor market would function and help them to understand monopsony. Just really fast though, let's remind everybody, we use monopsony. It's a big ugly word. I agree with you, Heather. But we all know monopolies are bad because at the end of the day, they produce too little at too high a cost. Monopsonies hire too few workers at too low a cost. If they raise their wages to the marginal product of their workers, they, in the end, would hire more workers, which would mean you'd get more output. So you know, I know we're all economists on this call and labor experts, but sometimes we need to remind people of this because I know a lot of people go, oh, this is really bad because you're going to cause inflation. And it's like, well, no, we're going to increase output if we can get employers to act as if they were in a competitive market. Larry, I know your hand is up, so let me let you ask a question.
Thanks. So, you know, first, you know, I want to praise the panelists for the body of work that they both have built and pointing to the policy directions that their work that Heather's trying to implement, Ioana has highlighted. I'm very supportive of them all. Okay, then the usual, but I want to draw out something that Ioana said recently, and that is I've always been a little uncomfortable with a lot of the reports that come out of the Treasury Department, White House, the research on concentration, because it all seems to point that the problem is a lack of competition and imperfections. Now, I come from a school of thought. Ray Marshall is my hero. He always said the invisible hand in the labor market is all thumbs. Alan Kruger in 2018 said, firms have wage setting power. This is the rule, not the exception. So there are broad segments of the labor force, employment, I think much larger than what you could point to that have labor concentration, which are competitive, which discriminate, where there's wage productivity divergence. And I don't want a focus on imperfections, as useful as it could be, to overlook the fact that that's, I think, a minor part of the story. And the last thing I'll say, because I know we're running out of time, if I had to praise the administration, in which I frequently do actually, it would be the attention to getting full employment quickly, as Bill was saying. And I think the ARP and even, probably some of the Trump era bipartisan legislation, which is responsible for the huge jump in job openings, the huge jump in job creation, the lowering of unemployment, has had a much larger effect on worker power issues than if we actually implemented all of these antitrust matters. As much as we should, I think, getting the full employment quickly is really one of the most powerful things you can do. And I just sort of think we should not lose sight of all the things outside of dealing with so-called imperfections.
Well, we're at time. I do want to commend Heather for highlighting how the economic report of the president did touch on many of those complexities, though, Larry. I mean, the not just market concentration, but the effects of discrimination and the effects of some of these other things that firms are doing that are examples of employers exerting undue power within the labor market. So I want to thank the panelists. We're at 3 o'clock. Fascinating discussion from my perspective. You can check out Ioana's podcast at Just Economics, and Heather put in the plug for the economic report of the president, and it is available online. So I think this is really great that we got to talk about a real live policy debate that's taking place, and we all can understand how important it is. This is not just an esoteric discussion. It's a chance to try and use what we have found and figure out how we can make things better. And that's a wonderful opportunity. And thank you to our panelists, because you brought both to the table for us to hear at the same time. I don't want to make you late to other sessions. It is 3 o'clock. And there is a recording of this panel that is available so that it's been memorialized. Thank you everyone for joining the audience. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, Bill.